Good afternoon and welcome back to the Indian Knowledge Systems course. Last year we started on an exploration of the idea of ancient India. That is to say, in simple terms, how did this whole Indian civilization came together as one identifiable thing? Of course, it has infinite variety, infinite diversity. We all know that. And yet there is something which is one at the end of the whole story. And that's what we started exploring last year. So we had great speakers in the fields of polity, historical traditions, scientific traditions, and a lot more. But we left out literature and the arts, and this is what we are focusing this semester, what we are focusing on. Now, in literature, there is something absolutely central to this construction of India, if I may call it so, what made this whole landmass integrated at a deep cultural level, and that is the Ramayana and Mahabharata. They play a very special role which almost no other texts played in any to any comparable extent. I'm very glad to announce that we will have a distinguished young scholar, Professor Vishwa Adluri, in a month or two, giving us 2 more lectures on Ramayana and Mahabharata, but from a completely different perspective, as you will see. So I'll not say more about it right now. My perspective today and tomorrow is going to be almost pedestrian, straightforward, and yet these are perspectives that we do not pay enough attention to. We do not reflect upon them, and they could be summed up in one term, and that is anthropological angle, anthropological lens of perspective. What happens to the people, but what happens to the people both in the text and outside the text? So in other words, how the texts, both Ramayana today and Mahabharata tomorrow, how they portray India, how they see India on the one hand, and on the other hand, how the people of India see those texts and how they play with those texts. So these are 2 different phenomena, very different, and they are of great importance in bringing this whole incredible ethnic, linguistic, even cultural to some extent diversity together. So one thing we must remember when we say that these are pan-Indian texts, they are much more than pan-Indian. They have been called by scholars pan-Asian. They are pan-Asian texts because they travel all over Asia. For example, Ramayana traveled to Burma, it traveled to Thailand, Indonesia, Korea, Vietnam, all the way to Japan. So this is well known, and China, of course, I was forgetting China. This is well known, it has been well documented. We have a lot of scholarly work on this. If you are lucky enough to visit the Angkor Wat temple of Cambodia, you will see panels up to 50 meters in length depicting main episodes of these 2 epics. So they had an incredible impact over the entire region, and that's why they were called Pan-Asian. But I'm not going to focus on the Asian perspective today because that would be too much. We will limit ourselves to India, which is already quite enough. And I'm just going to give a little sampling here and there of how we can look at this phenomenon. It is a phenomenon, and I think fairly unique in the history of humanity. If we take, for example, the 2 Greek epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, they are extraordinary texts, and they've had a very deep impact on the whole European culture, and yet not at all in any comparable extent, according to me. So before I start, I would like to give a couple of disclaimers. First of all, I'm not a great scholar in these texts, but I have gone over them again and again for a few decades, and I have read a number of scholars. So I'm going to bring together what I have absorbed from the angle that concerns us today. There are certain angles that do not interest me today, and one is the angle of historicity. So historicity, very briefly, is the question of whether the events depicted in the text are historical or not. Did they happen? Could you have, video recorded the great battle of the Mahabharata, or maybe Hanumanji flying to Sri Lanka or something of the sort? So are these historical texts is a question which many scholars have dealt with totally divergent conclusions. I can straight away tell you that there is no accepted conclusion at the end of the day, for very good reasons, that we are not going to have clinching evidence one way or the other. I am very much agnostic in this field. I believe that there are elements of history that must have found their way into those epics, but exactly how much, to what extent, what is the degree of embellishment, because they are poems, and poems embellish, or let us say, build upon a certain theme. That's the job of poets. They're not expected to be, history chroniclers. So to what extent are these historical elements present is going to be very difficult to ever ascertain, unless one day there is some spectacular archaeological evidence of one kind or another. We don't have that as of now, and therefore we're going to leave that question to the scholars if they want to play with it. And another question that a lot of people have been playing with in recent times is the question of the date. And almost every 2-3 weeks, I receive some work from one enthusiast or another, claiming to have proved that Ramayana happened on such and such a date, and the same with Mahabharata events. And those dates stretch from 7000 BC to 700 BC, and once again, even excluding the fanciful scholars, but taking only the more solid research in this field, which usually depends on astronomical clues in the text, we get absolutely divergent conclusions. So we're not going to spend time on this. I would like now to start on what, to me, is the important message, much more important, in fact, that questions of historicity or, dating and so on. What should we understand as far as the role of these two texts is concerned in creating India? In a way, this is really what they contributed to. So I will share a few slides and hopefully drag you into a discussion. So I called it the journey of a journey, because you know that Ramayana, Ayana means a journey, a progression, an advance. So this is a journey of Rama, and the text itself has a double journey. So, and as you can already see, it has inspired a lot of artists, and we have some incredible old paintings and painted manuscripts also. Long before, we had comics like Amarchita Katha, which many of you, I'm sure, would have read. We had the proto Amarchita Katha in the form of illustrated manuscripts. So this is one example. I'm going to show you a couple more. So first of all, we have to see the geography, and we will see that tomorrow. What I'm going to discuss about the Mahabharata is a kind of an amplified story. So Ramayana is more limited in its scale, in its outreach. Nevertheless, you can see, I'm going to use a pointer, that this is Kosala, the kingdom of Dasaratha, the ancestors of Rama in the story. And this is Ayodhya, its capital here. All right. And all the neighboring kingdoms are named. This, of course, is a historical element, because they are known to have been largely historical, and they are mentioned in a lot of other texts, from Panini to Patanjali to all kinds of dharma shastra texts and so on. So, of course, there is a semi-historical setting, but this is not in itself a proof of historicity. It's more complex than that. So let's skip that question for the time being. There are other kingdoms, especially for central India, which are mentioned, but not too many. It is more from the northwest, and you may remember in the story that Bharata, the brother of Rama, has to come back from the northwest, from Gandhara, to Ayodhya, and travels all the way non-stop to once he hears the news of what, the tragedy that has occurred in the palace. So there is a big axis, northwest to east, and it extends to the northeast, as we will see later. But there is also an axis from north to south, which is crucial to the story because that is the journey, that is the route, and I'll say more about it in a minute, that Rama, Sita, and Lakshmana are going to take. So this is probably one of the very first texts that explores the south in a I can't say in a systematic way because the geography remains a little scanty and it's very much limited, as we will see, to forested areas, with the exception of the capital of Kishkinda, the kingdom of the monkeys with quotation marks. There are no big cities, large cities, as there will be, for example, in Mahabharata. So these are the main two axes of and the two together kind of cover the geography of India, but not in very great detail if we compare to what we'll see tomorrow with the Mahabharata. There has been a question among scholars debated, and scholars have to spend their time debating such issues, which may not be of great relevance to the average reader of those texts or listener, because they were much more often in the past, listened to, heard, than read, properly speaking. And one of these questions is, Ramayana speaks about Lanka, the kingdom of Ravan. But is Lanka today Sri Lanka? Because Sri Lanka is a fairly recent term, a few centuries or so. In ancient India, Sri Lanka was called Tamraparni. If you read the edicts of Ashoka, for example, that is how the region is named. So why do we say that Sri Lanka corresponds to the Lanka of the Ramayana? There have been a lot of alternative theories locating Lanka somewhere in Madhya Pradesh, somewhere in what is today Telangana. But I'm not going to spend time on these because they do not really do justice to the text itself. And also, they don't do justice, as D.C. Sirkar, a very great Indian historian and epigraphist who wrote a lot in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, as he pointed out, all the later Indian texts that succeeded the Ramayana invariably place Lanka very close to South India. Lanka as an island in the sea that, of course, Ramayana itself describes, but close to the far south. So there is a consistency in the narrative, and we're going to just accept it because it makes no difference to us for our purpose today. So what about the journey? The journey of the heroes, the protagonists, the dramatis personae, as Western theater would call it. So there is a route which has been recreated by a number of scholars. This is one of the maps I found, and which crosses the Vindhyas, starting from the Kosala kingdom, crosses the Vindhyas, and the of course Ganga in the process, the Narmada river, and reaches a region close to Nashik of today, and then continues more or less along the margins of what we call today the Western Ghats. Now, there are many reasons for reconstructing this route, which I'll not spend time on. It's not very important for us. But what we have to realize, and this is going to be a very important factor towards the end of this talk, is that most of the Ramayana setting is forests, forested regions, not cities, not urbanized kingdoms, and this makes it in its whole spirit definitely an elder brother to the Mahabharata. Because another question that scholars have debated at great length is which is older of the two texts. Because in Indian tradition, we all know that Ramayana comes before. But there have been a number of scholarly arguments to try to prove that it was written after the Mahabharata. That also we will leave to them, and we will go by the traditional view for now. So let us look at this journey a little more closely. And here I'm going to use the work of several scholars like Meera Roy, the Indian historian of science, who wrote some important papers long back on the flora and fauna of the Mahabharata and Ramayana. And more recently, I'm jumping over a few scholars. We have Dr. Amritalingam, who was with the CPR Environmental Education Center in Chennai and Indological Center. And he spent years literally cataloging all the plants and also animals, but today we'll focus on the plants because it's more actually revealing, which are listed in the Ramayana. As I said, the general setting is forest and, jungle. And there are a lot of very beautiful, incidentally, beautiful descriptions of forest life, of the animals. And you know what role a particular golden deer played in the whole story. So the whole theme of nature is very strong, very deep, completely integrated in this epic. And then the forests are named. They are named, and the first that our heroes are going to settle in after crossing Ganga, you can see here Ganga here, and we'll come back to this crossing a little later, is the forest around Chitrakoot. Chitrakoot is just on the border today of Uttar Pradesh and Madhya Pradesh, if I'm not mistaken. And I think it is part of Uttar Pradesh, if I remember right. And of course, in those days, those boundaries have no significance. And this was a largely forested and hilly region from which they moved into this Dandaka Aranya. So Aranya again means forest. And there, of course, there are a lot of adventures, which you are all familiar with. A lot of demons are confronted, slaughtered, and then they reach Panchavati here, which is a more specific pocket of forest, which is where the great Asura Ravana is going to ravish Sita. So this is, according to the text, taking place here. And then they continue into Dandakaranya and finally reach the kingdom of the monkeys, with quotation marks. You will see why. Which is Kishkinda, as we know. And this is also another hugely forested region. And from there, they will go through mountain ranges into Lanka. So this word Shri here, if we're talking about an old context, should ideally not have figured on the map. It should be Lanka alone. But it's here we can see a mix of ancient and contemporary names, so that's okay. There are geographical difficulties here and there. For example, the text tells us that before emerging on the shore, they have to cross through a mountain range. So there's a little bit of Eastern Ghats here, but not much. And therefore, the description isn't very accurate. This raises some important questions. For example, is it that the composer, traditionally Valmiki, of course, was a little hazy about certain details, belonging to the other end of India almost? It's possible. Or is it that because it is a poem, again, some poetic license, was permissible? That's also quite understandable. If I'm a novelist today and I write a novel, whose setting is, for example, Kolkata, and I give some descriptions, I'm nevertheless not duty bound to give accurate descriptions. I can use my imagination also and transform Kolkata's landscape if I wish. So all kinds of literary explanations are possible. We will not go deeper into this. So this is the basic journey. But then something happens, and this is the work of Dr. Amirtalingam, building upon a few predecessors. He found that the species of fruit-bearing trees, flowering trees, hardwood trees, grasses, medicinal herbs in all of these forests are meticulously described. We have long lists of them. So he's compiled them. And some of them, I will not read them out, you can have a look if you wish. Some of them are pan-Indian. If I take neem, for example, it's all over India. But some are not. And what he's done is basically by comparing the species listed in the Chitrakoot episode with those, and this is incidentally a beautiful painting from an extraordinary manuscript, the Mewar Ramayana manuscript, which was recently digitalized by the British Library, digitized, and you can see it on the net. It's absolutely fabulous. Hundreds and hundreds of such paintings. So this is our three heroes here and again there, and building a kind of a hut in the forest. So to come back to what I said, listing forest after forest, those species, like here, for example, we have different tree species in the Dandaka Aranya. And in Panchavati, which is on the fringe of the Dandaka Aranya, we have more species. And if we continue, we will have in Kishkinda again some other species. And what he found was that while certain species are common to all, others are not. And they are not because they are specific to those regions and to those types of forests. So we had dry, deciduous forest. We have now dry and moist deciduous forest, and so on. And he has tried to order it all. And what he finds, and this is very interesting, it's a completely fresh angle, if I may say so, is that the text makes sense. It makes sense with a journey going all the way to South India. So you might say, if you're interested in those scholarly debates, that this is an argument in favor of a fairly, I won't say accurate, but broadly correct geographical sense of the subcontinent, and also a good knowledge of the flora. So Dr. Amirtalingam continues with the fauna, but I will not take it up because the fauna is less specific usually, less region specific than the flora. And this shows that either the authors of this text, Ramayana, had somehow traveled and had already noted these, or rather, perhaps more likely, in my opinion, they borrowed from a lot of regional traditions. And you know that botany in ancient India was a fundamental component of the medicine, Ayurveda in particular. It was one of the pillars of Ayurveda. And therefore there was a very detailed botanical knowledge of many regions, and perhaps Ramayana borrowed this. Be that as it may, we will continue, but it is important to see that this pan-Indianness is not just a literary device. It rests on some very concrete knowledge. And it continues, in fact, with evergreen moist forest. And this is from Lanka itself, where we have more species, some of which do not exist in North India. And therefore, we do see the journey happening. So this is, for this part, the conclusion that the flora, the way it is listed and described, is entirely compatible with the journey's geography, the whole setting. Now, this is for the plants, and I have left the animals alone, but we could be reaching very similar conclusions. But let us look at human beings. And first of all, what we call tribes. Now, tribes, I use quotation marks because it is a word that I dislike, and many anthropologists dislike, for the reason that this is a European term which was created in the 19th century. I mean, it was used earlier, but it was integrated in the new discipline of anthropology in the 19th century with a very deeply racial and generally racist context. Tribes were seen, this was the heyday of racist theories, where in the first half, especially of the 19th century, the white race was, of course, superior to all. And the blacker, the more primitive, and primitive races basically had no hope of rising to civilization unless they were, taken charge of by the white race. So this is a scenario we are all very familiar with. But then this concept of tribe, and this is crucial. In fact, I think I had an entire lecture in an earlier Indian knowledge systems course a couple of years ago on this topic. The concept of tribe does not exist in ancient India. You'll be very surprised to know there are no tribes. What does exist are isolated populations which live in forests or in mountains, and they are described as such. They will be called, with corresponding Sanskrit names, they will be called forest dwellers, they will be called mountain dwellers. Some live in the deserts. We will see this in greater detail tomorrow, in fact, with the Mahabharata. The point is here that there is no disconnect, no radical disconnect between the mainstream society that lives, for example, in the kingdoms, in cities, or in rural areas which are also well frequented. There is no disconnect between this mainstream society and what we call today tribal societies. And they are all janas. I will amplify this point tomorrow. They are all janas. There is no fundamental difference between mainstream society and so-called tribal society. So we will be using this term, unfortunately, but with great caution, and remembering that there is no judgment, derogatory judgment passed on them in the Indian text. There may be occasional negative remarks here and there. It's entirely possible, but this can apply to any chosen community here or there in the literature. It is not something specific to what we call tribals today. So the Ramayana mentions a few such tribes, but there are problems. Let me explain. First of all, I mentioned that Rama, as you know, and Lakshman sometimes have to fight, even when they were young people, teenagers, learning from their guru. They have sometimes to fight and kill Rakshasa to rid regions from certain Rakshasa. Now, Rakshasa is a demon. But many scholars, under the influence of European anthropologists of the 19th century, began identifying those Rakshasas with actual populations. It's a difficult exercise unless there is corroborative evidence from other texts or from maybe inscriptions. It's extremely difficult to say whether particular demons portrayed in the literature are demonized actual populations. It can happen, but to be sure that this is the case requires additional evidence. So I'm going to remain agnostic here. And for example, Kabandha, Virada are demons that Rama and Lakshman kill in the story. But are there also tribal communities, as some scholars have maintained, is difficult to establish. And you see, sometimes you will find today tribal communities bearing those names. So this is also brought out as evidence, but it is not necessarily so simple. It could be that there is a continuous tradition right from those days, but it could also be that the story traveling for 2000 years, led to some communities adopting those names. And this is well known in the world of anthropology. So having a subsistence of names is not in itself categorical evidence. It is at best circumstantial evidence. And the same goes with the Vanaras. So the Vanaras, or the monkeys, and sometimes the bears also, are another big scholarly debates. You can see that our anthropologists and ethnologists have been mining these texts to try to bring out more understanding of ancient Indian society, but it's a complex and delicate exercise, and sometimes it is done a little recklessly, jumping to conclusions without looking at the complexity of the question. So here the question is that the Vanaras are described mainly as monkeys, and they have tails, they jump, they climb trees, and so on. So if you take it at the first level, the first degree, they very much look like animals. But then they have a city. You see, the capital of Kishkinda is a mighty city. So is it that this is a kind of allegory for a slightly more primitive population, which the text wants to portray as such? Is it that it is some kind of symbolic depiction of a population? All of these questions have been discussed extensively, and once again, there are different opinions at the end of the day. It's difficult to be absolutely sure. The best we can do today is to read the text and see whether we can find more clues. So again, Jatayu, you know the story of Jatayu, the courageous, brave vulture who sacrifices himself in pursuit of Ravana. And Jatayu also has been associated with certain tribes as a totemic symbol. So the tribes will worship and identify with this bird, who then becomes the Ishtadevata, as it were, of the whole community. So again, is it actually just a bird as in the story, or more? Of course, it is a talking, speaking bird, as his brother also will be. All these questions remain. However, there are certain cases where, and this is a picture of by Ravi Varma of Jatayu, dying in pursuit of ravished Sita. So there are certain situations where we are on safer ground, and one is the case of the Nishadas. The Nishadas in the Mahabharata, in the Ramayana story, are a mountain tribe which lives in the Vindhya range, and their king, as you know, is Guha, and Guha actually welcomes Rama and Lakshmana and Sita and all those who follow till Ganga, up to Ganga, from the departure of Ayodhya. He welcomes them and feeds them all. He's a mighty king, and his kingdom, because, as I said, tribes are not exactly what we understand by tribes. They are clans, and sometimes they are mighty clans. And socially, it is very well accepted and easy to establish that in ancient India, a lot of these tribal clans, especially those that turn to warfare, integrated the Varna system, the caste system, straight at the level of Kshatriyas. Many Kshatriyas have tribal origins, especially in North India. That is an aside. The point here is that we have this Nishada community, and today there are Nishads, as you know, in those regions, in the Gangetic regions, who of course claim descent from Guha. Whether this is a historical fact or not is very difficult to establish. Excuse me. And this is very interesting because we see that the clan is powerful. The king is highly respected. He's a friend of Rama. They know each other from before, and he's going to help Rama, Lakshmana, and Sita to cross Ganga and then move towards Chitrakoot. So the whole Nishada clan is portrayed in a very happy and positive light in the story. So these are some of them, and here you see, in fact, from the same manuscript, Mewar manuscript, you see now in Kishkinda, Rama, Sita, Lakshmana with the monkeys going. I'm sorry, Sita is missing. It is Rama, Lakshmana, and Sugriva here, crowned Sugriva, who sends the monkeys in all directions in search of Sita. So Sita is definitely absent. So now something extremely important and interesting happens, which is a reversal of the story. That is to say, the story will, and I could, of course, go on and on. It's very easy to pick out more passages from the text, but it tries to integrate a good chunk of India at the social level, at the geographic level, and so on. But then the reverse happens. And in India, in turns, integrates the text, assimilates it, digests it, and reformulates it in any number of ways. So you have tribes, for example, this Sabara tribe of Orissa and West Bengal, who will claim that Shabari, this old woman devotee who appears in the Ramayana, belong to their tribe. Geographically, it doesn't make very much sense because West Bengal is definitely not part of the route of the journey. But you see here, we should not be concerned with accuracy, with even any degree of precision in those claims. It is the phenomenon of claiming which is central to our understanding. So similarly, I mentioned the Nishads descending from Guha according to them. Gonds in central India, Gond tribals, claim descent interestingly from Ravana, and they have temples to Ravana, to Mandodari, his wife, and Meghanad, also known as Indrajit. And in some traditions, he was actually one of their ancient kings. And they still take out processions of Ravana. So you can see that this is extremely important because it shows that the plot of the story itself, leave alone details, even the central plot can be altered. And in many retellings, many adaptations, it has been altered. So this is something fundamental. I'll return to it in my conclusion. Telugu tribes also have a lot of traditions attaching them to Ramayana, including their very names sometimes, the name of people like Ravanama, Ravanappa, and so on. The Bhils, the Mundas, the Centrals, all of them, central to Eastern India, have their own versions of the epic, and it is the same in the Northeast also. Still in central India, the Baiga tribe have an interesting departure. And in fact, there has been scholarly work documenting all these departures, and it's very fascinating. So here, you know the story, of course, with the Agni Pariksha that Sita has to undergo upon the return from Lanka. But here in their story, it is Lakshman who has to undergo this Agni Pariksha. So to prove his purity. So this is fascinating, but what we see through all this, and then most tribes of the Northeast, and there is in fact an entire book compiled, edited by the anthropologist K.S. Singh. I'm going to return to him in a minute, who have their own versions of the Ramayana. For example, one of them has, with all names transformed, it is not Rama, it is not Sita. They are given names in their own languages. But Ayodhya, for example, it's a palace of bamboo. So the whole setting is translocated, transcreated, and still somewhere, somehow, it is still the Ramayana. And this is what matters. In fact, I would like to read a longish passage of K.S. Singh, who was Director General of the Anthropological Survey of India for many years, and he's no more. one of India's finest post-independence anthropologists, and the spirit behind the People of India project of the Anthropological Survey of India, which is about 27 massive volumes documenting more than 4,700 communities of India. And during his travels across India, he noted certain things, including this on the Rama Katha, that is the retellings of Rama traditions in tribal context. So let me briefly read this out. He says that on the one hand, he collected a number of songs composed by tribal and non-tribal poets, which seemed like verbatim translations of the story, rendered with passion and conviction. On the other hand, and this is important, there were also songs which appeared older, more closely related to the tribal worldview and their mores, which suggested that some aspects of Ramakatha had almost been internalized. Subsequently, I came across various versions of Ramakatha among the Mundas, Gons, Korkus, Kols, Savaras, Bondos, and so on, which did not suggest the existence of any mini Ramayana or mini Ramakatha as such, but represented an echo from the past, a stirring of tribal memory of what they might have heard from their forefathers or of what they might have imbibed through the teachings of the mendicants called Gosains who traveled through their land. And those mendicants are actually called sometimes the Harikatha scholars, the Harikatha travelers, narrators. They also reflected a sense of awe and admiration for the heroes and sometimes delight and fun at their presence in their homeland. There is even a streak of irreverence in the Ramakatha versions of some of the tribes who also identify themselves without any inhibition and in a forthright manner with what we might call the anti-heroes, such as Meghnada or Ravana, as we just saw with the Gons. So this is important. It is a leading anthropologist looking at all these traditions and understanding the cultural impact of the text on these tribes, which actually the entire European scholarship in the 19th century never stopped declaring to be divorced from Indian mainstream society. Again, that is not the Indian tradition. They were not regarded as divorced, except sometimes a little bit geographically because of isolation, but not culturally. And this is a brilliant proof of this. So therefore, the fact that Indian tribes have no connection with the belief or thought systems of mainstream Indian society is not valid anthropologically. It's easy to disprove. I could give much more. I just selected randomly some remarks by the famous Malayalam poet K. Sachidanandan, who said that in Malayalam alone, there are at least 23 Ramayanas, including one Patal Ramayanam, where Ravana is helped by another Ravana who lives in the netherworld called Patal Ravana. When Ravana is about to fail, Patal Ravana sends his army to help Ravana in the war against Rama. So this is again quite a departure, and it's possible, it's fine, but somehow the Ramayana still survives through all this. And there are so many oral and folk versions of Ramayana, like the one that the Bhils have, for example, where there is not even a war because they don't believe in violence. They don't believe in war. Ravan realizes his mistake and returns Sita to Ram and thus arrives at a kind of compromise. And there is a Telugu women's oral Ramayana where the woman is very central and Sita becomes the main character, and so on and so forth. So before we conclude, I'll have a very quick look, very imperfect, but this aspect has to be mentioned, at how it's not just through oral retellings and sometimes written adaptations, translations, transcreations of the text. It's also by fixing landmarks on the landscape. And this is the phenomenon called sacred geography, which today is a full-fledged discipline in Western scholarship. And many ancient cultures had a sacred geography, But in India, it's remarkably large and complex. This is just a quotation from Diana Eck, one of the best authors on the question. Her book is very commendable, India, A Sacred Geography, and she writes how a particular idea of India that is shaped not by the modern notion of a nation state. You see, that's what many people do not understand, but by the extensive and intricate interrelation of geography and mythology that has produced this vast landscape of tirthas. It is an idea that is at least 2000 years old, and it is an idea that has been enacted in the practice of pilgrimage for many centuries. So very briefly, because this could be, you know, a whole hour spent on the geography of the Ramayana would not be sufficient. Of course, Nashik, the region of Panchavati, has numerous landmarks associated, and so has Chitrakoot and ashrams. And sometimes it may be a cave, it may be a rock, or it may be a whole forest. So this is here associated with the ravishment of Sita. Near Kanpur, I remember visiting a small village, you might call it, called Bitur. Very fascinating, with a lot of old temples, not very old, probably not more than 2 or 3 or 400 years. And there is an ashram of Valmiki, there is a kitchen of Sita, and there is even a well into which she jumped at the end of the story. So, of course, it's a little bit adapted here. Valmiki has his ashram there, as I mentioned, but he has his ashram in many other parts of India. There is a Valmiki ashram in Kerala also. So you can see that, again, accuracy is absolutely not the concern. What is the concern is creating landmarks that allow you to connect yourself more easily to that grand narrative, this larger story of the Ramayana, which in a way becomes the story of India. Rameshwaram obviously has a number of landmarks. I visited it many years ago, and including the Setu, the so-called bridge. I'm not going into that question, but it is, of course, a lot of these locations on the island are associated with different episodes of the travel to Lanka and back after the victory. So it's quite fascinating how the landscape itself becomes an incarnation of the story. So the story owns the landscape, the geography, and the geography returns the compliment by owning the text. This is one of the, and so on, of course, in every region of India. I think it's time to conclude. I do not want to overstep. Maybe I will deal more with the why and how tomorrow, because this is a question absolutely common with the Mahabharata. I have found this interesting quote of Nehru, who expresses surprise at seeing how illiterate villagers, you see, would know hundreds of verses by heart of the Ramayana and Mahabharata, and all the episodes of the story were very well known. This is something that I verified myself in Tamil Nadu with illiterate villagers I was in touch with, and they would know the whole story in great detail, even though they couldn't read anything. So we will amplify upon this tomorrow. This is a painting of the one Harikatha in session, but it's a very special Harikatha session, which I will dwell upon a little more tomorrow. We will see these two protagonists, and maybe I should mention today that this is Lava and Kusha, the two sons of Rama. He has not yet understood, or he's beginning to suspect, that they are his sons. And what is extraordinary here is that they come to the court and they narrate to him the whole story of the Ramayana. So within the story, you have the story. Just as Valmiki himself, the author, becomes a character in the whole story. So these extraordinary devices have fascinated people at large, and they are part of the how. But we will expand this a little more tomorrow. These are some of the texts that I consulted. There are actually more, and I've borrowed maps in particular from Dr. Amirtalingam and a few other sources. I will close here for today.